Hello friends, Gerry Wagoner from Ohio. I'm here to tell you today the story of our journey, my wife and I, how we went from the Anabaptist movement to the Advent movement. I've titled the story The Falling Mantle, and I ask you to pray with me as we begin. Father, each of us have a testimony, and our prayer today is that each of our stories would be heard, would be encouraging to one another, and would ultimately speak of you. For we ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. I would like to illustrate my story, my testimony, with a story from the Bible that has always been fascinating to me. The setting of this Bible story is just beyond the Jordan River. In the area of Jericho, you see two men cross the Jordan River, and they stand there for a moment in the wilderness. Elijah and Elisha. In my mind's eye, I can see the hand of the older man resting gently on the shoulder of the younger man. A request is made from the younger man. A conditional promise is given, and then they move on. And then all of a sudden, the Lord of heaven shows up. A chariot from heaven itself burst into the atmosphere, and it comes down near the earth. It picks up Elijah. He's now gone, and in the silence that fills that wilderness, you see a piece of cloth falling gently to the ground. Suddenly, the most important thing in the world to Elisha is what? That old piece of cloth. And he runs over to it, picks it up, and holds it to himself. It's all that he has left of a dear friend. But more than that, it symbolizes a promise, a request granted. A double portion of the spirit of Elijah now rests upon Elisha. My friends, I would like to ask you a question this morning. What mantle are you wearing? Has it fallen from heaven? Or does it come from men? What mantle do you have in your life? What is there around your shoulders that identifies you as connected to heaven? You see, that mantle that fell from heaven that Elisha ran and picked up was old. It was probably threadbare. It was worn. And it may symbolize how some people who are born into a religious movement, a Christian movement, eventually come to regard that movement. After a while, it becomes old and threadbare and a bit worn to them. You see, the Advent mantle, dear friends, the Advent message has fallen from heaven. It hasn't really come from our parents. It's come from heaven. Now, your parents may have lived that message in a righteous way and in an alluring way that has attracted you to it. But ultimately, the Advent message comes from heaven, my friends. That Advent message has a great power in it. It will soon divide the waters of humanity. There's something else about that mantle. It has to be picked up, doesn't it? No, you can't just leave it lie there on the ground and go your own way satisfied. You have to pick it up. If that mantle is going to become you and the symbolic power of the Spirit of God is going to become yours, you have to pick it up. And it's the same way with the Advent mantle, dear ones. You have to pick it up and you have to make it yours if it's going to be yours. I was raised in an old German Baptist Brethren home, as were 7 generations before me. I would have been the 8th generation, and I was the 8th generation for a while. I guess you could say one of the mantles that I was given in the heritage of my fathers was a black hat, a broad-rimmed black hat, and pants that buttoned instead of zipped. For my wife, it was a little different. She wore a prayer covering and the uniform of the church, which was a very modest female dress. Now, as you might expect with a group that has ties going all the way back to the Radical Reformation, believers' baptism was a choice that you must make when you are ready and not before. None of this infant baptism, but only when you are ready and when you understand the implications of the gospel and you say, I'm ready. For me, that choice came 2 years after we were married, 1984. I joined the church of my fathers that year, baptized in the chilly spring that flowed through my Uncle Carl's farm. There was no heavenly phenomenon as I walked up out of the cold water that morning. Just the quiet realization that I was carrying the torch for yet one more generation. Now, this was expected of me, of course, and I was very comfortable in this role. And I began to fulfill my 20th century Anabaptist role in the best way that I could, comfortable in the approval of my peers. We had a lot of friends, and I had a lot of family in the church, many uncles that I looked up to that were leaders. 2.5 years went by. Now I will show you just a few pictures. There is a picture of the mantle of Elijah falling from heaven. These are my people. This tent in the background you see there is what's called annual meeting. Every year somewhere around the country they have their annual meeting, and there they make decisions. They have some of the most wonderful fellowship that you can imagine. They stay in each other's homes and they just have a good time. Again, this picture is from annual meeting. These are sisters in the church. My wife wore the same dress that you see here. These gentlemen here live in the county just west of me. They're in Ohio. The individual on the right is one of my old softball buddies. We used to play a lot of softball. We grew up without television and radio, but we had a lot of other things that we did to fill in the gaps. And it created a lot of good, healthy pastimes. Softball was one of them. Gerald Flora there, the man on the right. That's my Uncle Carl, my Aunt Mildred. This is the man that married Nancy and I in 1982. Wonderful couple, dear people, both gone now. There's a picture of me on the left and my father on the right. Dad was a polio victim. He contracted polio 3 months after they were married in 1954. And so they had 3 normal months together as husband and wife, and then their life changed dramatically. He lost most of the use of his arms and legs. Good man, wonderful man, devoted his whole life to helping people. And I was very comfortable in that environment. I was determined to be the best German Baptist I could be. My father had hoped that I would become a preacher in the church. That would have been his greatest aspiration for me. And I have to tell you that was the path I was probably on. But in 1986, a colorful brochure showed up in the mail advertising a Daniel and Revelation seminar there in Ohio. The brochure came into the mailbox of a friend of mine, a business partner, and we shared a meal with them that evening, and Eric brought this brochure out and we passed it around the table. Everybody got a look at it and said, "What do you think of this? It's talking about Revelation, about the future, about Bible and about prophecy and all these kind of things. And I could tell that he was kind of interested in it, and I was too. So just before dessert, I made a suggestion. Why don't you and I, Eric, just you and I, sneak out to this meeting and see what it's all about? If it's good, maybe we'll go back. But just you and I. Well, the wives would stay at home, our children. So that's what we did. Eric and I got in our car, we got our hats, and we drove over to where the meeting was held. So without knowing a whole lot about it, we just went in there, and we did it kind of covertly. In the church of my fathers, you're not encouraged to do things like that, at least not openly. So we went in there, and I put my black hat on the coat rack. Eric put his beside mine. And we went in and sat down in this small auditorium. And I can't speak for the rest of the audience that night, but there were two German Baptist men sitting there, just riveted to their seats by what we were hearing. I remember it well. The very first night was on the 70 weeks of Daniel. And I was absolutely thrilled as I watched this panoramic prophecy unfold and touch down exactly where it was predicted that it would, ending in the book of Acts. Amazing stuff. You see, Jesus Christ was lifted up in that prophecy. And I found it irresistible. I was drawn to it. Just as Jesus said it would be, if I'm lifted up, I will draw all men unto myself. My friends, I heard this message for the first time in my life. Some of you have heard it many, many times from a little boy or little girl on up. Is your mantle from heaven or is it from men? Well, on the ride home that evening, we talked about what we had learned. We were both pretty excited about it. Eric was an excitable fella, and he was pretty excited, and I was too. So we went home. On the next night, which was Monday night, we went back again, took our wives and children with us this time. We said, you're coming with us. And they did, and we went and we got a good seat down front, and we sat there. And night after night there in 1986, I returned to that same spot. The Bible would open itself to me in new ways under the supervision of the Holy Spirit. And like the unnamed disciples on the Emmaus Road, we would often say to each other, did not our hearts burn within us as we learned these things? As the Scriptures were opened, we were drawn to them. And I began to discover that the Bible was held together by an extraordinary power. You see, each night we were handed a link, a golden link, if you will, of a chain, and it was a lovely link. And there were 27 links, as I recall. And each one of them were unique and winsome in their own way. But by themselves, they didn't have a lot of strength, a lot of power. But when you began connecting all those links together, and finally at the end of this seminar, the chain was complete. Wow. Jesus had been lifted up, and I was drawn to him. It was like walking down a hallway with 27 windows. And every so often I would stop and pause and look in one of those windows, and I would see Jesus Christ from a unique perspective, doctrinal perspective. And it was beautiful, and it was alluring, and it was liberating somehow. I attended every one of those meetings, even after circumstances prevented me from attending a few of them. I had to go to Minneapolis on a business trip. At that point in my life, I had just started a commercial roofing company as a 24-year-old boy, and I was now 26. And the business was just starting to move along pretty good, and I had to go to a meeting in Minneapolis. dealing with spray foam insulation. So I went there, and I missed out on probably 3 or 4 nights of this seminar. But I couldn't wait to get back, and I couldn't wait to learn what I had missed while I was gone. And they were kind enough to give me some amazing facts Bible studies that covered all the material that I had missed when I was in Minneapolis. And I still remember that amazing facts brochure that had the tall hat, where the hat was actually wider than it was tall, but it didn't look that way. I probably still have that somewhere. So here I was, coming down to the end of these meetings. And by this point, I had learned 3 serious truths. Number 1, the Bible is held together by an extraordinary power. Remember that chain I told you about? Yeah. It's the power of truth. And the truth is a person. As Jesus himself said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man ever dared make such a claim. But Jesus did. Well, that was enough to occupy my mind for a long time. However, I had been brought face to face with certain truths of Jesus, like conditional immortality, the judgment confronting everyone, the everlasting gospel, Sabbath rest, and the panoramic view of redemptive history. We call it the Great Controversy. Wow. Each one of those beautiful links in that chain were a specific, unique truth that set me free from misconceptions that I had grown up with for 7 generations. Now, having said that, let me affirm that I learned many wonderful things in the church of my fathers, and I appreciate those things, and that which is biblical I have held on to. But there were certain scriptural myths, as we are told in the Great Controversy, that began to encircle Christianity down through the ages, and we were no different in some of those areas. For instance, the revelation that when you die, you don't go directly to heaven or hell was somehow very comforting to me to learn that. And I could see all the verses in the Bible, and I said, no problem, it's in there and I want it. You see, I'd grown up with the Uncle Arthur Bible story books. Funny little story about that. My parents had a set of them, and I read them as a boy. I thought they were great. When I became an Adventist years later, my dad kind of muttered under his breath, I knew I should have gotten rid of those books. I reached in my pocket, pulled out my checkbook, and I said, how much do you want for them? He said, I think I'll keep them. Good choice. So what do I do with all this truth that I was shown? It was like water from a well. And they all pointed to Jesus and his unbelievable love. Every doctrine of the Adventist church said something about Jesus. As I walked down that hallway and looked in each one of those windows, they would show Jesus in a unique light. And they all pointed to the wonderful love of God as he reveals his truth to humanity. But now I had a problem. Yeah. Where had these truths been for 7 generations? Where were you, Jesus? I've never seen you this clearly before or in this light. You see, truth has an uplifting, ennobling element to it. And as I was confronted with all of this truth in these meetings, they began to fasten themselves upon me. I was drawn to them, but at the same time, part of me was resisting them, going back to that unspoken question, where had these truths been for 7 generations? Maybe they weren't truths after all. So I was shaken to the core. Revelation seminar, indeed, there had been a revelation. So I did the only thing I could think of. I got out my Bible and began to study it carefully. Now, my Bible was fairly small in those days. It was given to me as a gift when I was baptized. And so I went to what we call Odd Lots there in Ohio. They call it Big Lots now. It's a chain for a lot of refurbished material. And I went there and I found a Bible, white cover, and had wide margins. It was $9.88. They do the 88 thing instead of the 99 thing we got from the Dutch. I bought that Bible. I brought it home and had plenty of room to write in it, in the margins, and I read it through in about 3 months' time. I was testing every one of those links in that chain systematically. And come to number 1. Okay, number 2. And I go on to number 3. The immortality of the soul. The condition of man in death, is that true? The promise of the resurrection, and how it all ties together. I checked each link in that chain to see if I could break it. Maybe I'd missed something, you know. 7 or 8 generations can't be wrong. And so I resolved to disprove this message that had shaken my foundation. But I would learn in the next 2 years of intensive Bible study that if a pillar of faith topples, and there were several that did during this 2 years, they were a false pillar. They weren't real. Jesus does not fail, and you know why? Because his mantle is from heaven. Where's your mantle, my friend? Where's mine? Is it from heaven or from men? At the end of 2 years of this research, I had earned the suspicion of my wife, who quietly watched her husband confirm this message that he had set out to disprove. I spent 2 years trying to disprove this stuff because it troubled me. Now, if I believed it was false, I would have just said, okay, it was interesting, it's not true, and I would have thrown it away, and that had been the end of it, but I could not walk away from it. It had slowly fastened itself around my neck, and the only thing I could do was prove it to be wrong. So I worked at it pretty hard. And by the way, nowadays, sometimes people come to me in the Adventist church, and they're angry or upset at the church. And I understand where some of that comes from. But it's a beautiful message that we have. And the Advent church, in spite of all of its challenges, is full of a lot of beautiful people. People who want to know Jesus and they want to see him come. And I'm glad that you're a part of that. And today, sometimes people come to me and they'll want to condemn the church or criticize the church. And I tell them, don't trouble me with that. I tried harder than you did for 2 years. Don't bother me with that. This went on for 2 years' time. I went to a Christian bookstore down in Salem Avenue in Dayton, and I bought a book titled Avoiding the Snare of Seventh-day Adventism. How about that? Not a very objective title, is it? No. Written by David W. Cloud, who in the opening pages identified himself as a once saved, always saved individual. Therefore, he writes from that perspective with a particular theological beef against Arminianism. And it was out of that beef that he condemned the Advent message. I read the book, and I also read that $9.88 Bible that I got from Big Lots. I still have that Bible. Get it out every now and then just to remember the old times. My wife was watching all this. She was very comfortable in the Anabaptist church of my father's. Her family had been raised Catholic, and there are very few converts into the German Baptist church, but her family was one of those converts, family of 12 children. And so they joined the church way back in the 70s. And she became a member, her parents became a member, and that's how I met Nancy. And she was very comfortable in this way of life, and she wondered at times if what I was doing was threatening that comfort, and it was. But here's what happened during that 2-year time. I went from a well-respected individual to a complete moron in the eyes of many of my erstwhile friends and family. I was smart enough to, which isn't real smart, but I was smart enough to conceal what I was doing studying this message. I did it all privately. I did confide in my father a couple of times that I had questions about the Sabbath, and he said, that's nothing that we need to be worried about. He said the disciples met on the first day of the week. I said, well, that's not the whole story. They met for fear of the Jews, the Bible says. And he knew that I was looking into it, but at that point it wasn't critical in any way, and I was quiet about it. But slowly, as I was studying the message, the Advent mantle was fastening itself around my shoulders and my neck. And I was being held a prisoner now. In 1988, it was coming to a head. I'd been into this now for 2 years. And no prisoner has been held tighter by these chains of convictions that were fastening around my neck. But the best was yet to come. You see, intellectual assent to the Advent message wasn't enough. There had to be something that happened at the heart level. And that came to a head in 1988. It was a year of complete turmoil. I would push the study of the Advent message aside because it was making me tense. I didn't know where I belonged anymore. And yet it was so attractive to go back and review those beautiful links of the chain. And so I would pick the Bible back up and I would look back through the things that I'd been taught in the Adventist meeting, and I would compare that with the things that I were taught as a boy from the Anabaptist. And some of them were good things, but there were many powerful truths that had been concealed from me. Now I had them here in my hands. What do I do with it? It came to a head in 1988. One evening, amidst the confusion that I felt over the tremendous pull of my heritage against the power of the Advent message, I fell to my knees one night in late 1988, and I prayed probably like I never have before. It was a simple prayer, but it was profound because it came from the heart, and I said, Lord, please help me. You alone know the struggle within me. Just take it out of my hands and lead me by your will. That is the only thing that I want. I want your will and your will alone. If you want me to be a German Baptist the rest of my life, I will be the best one possible. I promise. If you want me to become a Seventh-day Adventist, I will be the best one possible. I want your will and your will alone. Something happened that night in that prayer. I guess Gethsemane was behind me. God took it out of my hands when the morning broke. My life began to reveal a series of events, as if I was being guided by a hand from heaven. God had heard, and He had been listening, and He cared. Now He was guiding. Gethsemane was close behind me. And it was then that I began to take step after step in the direction of the Advent movement. The next morning I got up. My wife was out of town. She had made the trip to Indiana to a baby shower of one of her relatives, a new child. And so I was there in the house by myself. And lo and behold, it was Saturday morning. I thought, there's a church not too far away. Maybe I'll just run over there and see what it's all about. An Adventist church. I had no idea what time they started. I took a guess that 10 o'clock might be a good starting point. So I jumped in the truck and drove over there and pulled into the parking lot and walked in. And pastor there at the door said, hello, how are you? And I said, fine. And I introduced myself. And he said, so what's going on in your life? Oh, boy. It's almost like God told him to ask that. And I said, no, I'm fine. Good year. I didn't want to tell him all the turmoil I was going through, but later on, as I became a little more trusting and comfortable, I said, you know, it's actually been a year of turmoil. I've been studying the Advent message, and I'm not sure what to do about it. He said, oh, dear. I remember it well. He said, oh, dear. He said, well, hey, we're having a potluck after church. He said, you're welcome to stay. They don't have meat. And okay. I said, I knew I needed to clean up my diet. I didn't know how. So I said, that's fine. I'll stay. Plus, Nancy wasn't home to provide some good cooking, so here's a way to get a free meal. So I listened to the sermon. The sermon was, does God mean what He says? Well, He sure does, and I needed to hear it that day. And then I sat down there and I ate the potluck meal, and the pastor sat beside me, and he said, you know, you mentioned that you've been studying some this year. And I said, yeah, sure have. He said, would you like to get together with me? And maybe we can study the Bible if you have any questions. And I said, yes. He said, all right, where should we meet? I'll come to your house. And I said, nope. not coming to my home, but I'll meet you somewhere neutral. He said, great, you can meet me here at the church on Thursday night. Would that work for you? Yes. Thursday night it was, 7 o'clock. After supper on Thursday night, I told Nancy, I said, I'm going to go for a drive. And I was. I went for a drive to Piqua, to the church, and I drove there. Pulled into the parking lot. There was one other vehicle there. Great. And I thought that must be this pastor. And I have some questions I was going to hit him with. Went inside and he wasn't there. There was a school teacher there working on some material, curriculum for the children. So I paced around in the foyer for a while, for 5 minutes, waiting on the pastor. He's probably running late, you know. And then 10 minutes went by, and then it was 15, and it was 20, and then it was 30. And I'm starting to feel awfully alone at this point. So I stuck my head in that office where that school teacher was, and I said, I guess this pastor is coming. He said, I'm going to call him. He said, it's not like him to be late. So he called, and he got a hold of the pastor's wife, found out he was in another town over an hour away, and he had forgotten the meeting. He stood me up. Not off to a good start, right? Actually, I think God arranged it. Instead of going home, I got to talking to this school teacher. He and I became very good friends. It began that night. He shared with me his testimony, how he had been attending college in Cincinnati. He was an atheist. Could care less about God, the things of God. He believed that if there were answers, science had them. And he was also a bit of a fatalist at that point in his life, thinking there was really no way out. And he found Jesus Christ down there in the University of Cincinnati from a former Adventist. And he told me the story, and my heart just thrilled as I listened. We were so different, he and I, where we come from. Him from an atheistic, unbelieving background, me from a long, heavy train of tradition. But I shared with him my story, and then he asked me a question, would you like to pray? And I said, do you mean out loud? He said, yeah, if you're comfortable with that. And I wasn't, but I said, sure, I'll give it a whirl. So we knelt down there, and I prayed a very simple prayer. Lord, I need some help. Show me where to go and what to do. And God did. And so I took step after step in the direction of the Advent movement, and now I was unable to hide it any longer. Word broke out among my childhood peers, my German Baptist friends. Rumors about me went from Ohio all the way to California. In 2 weeks' time, I went from well-respected to complete idiot in the opinions of my fellow church members, and that's to be expected. They didn't understand. I don't hold that against them. Through it all, I had to cling to something, though, and I clung to the Scriptures as I now understood them, and the one to whom they pointed. I was never, ever going to let go of those beautiful truths and the one to whom they pointed. Vaguely, I remember thinking in late 1988, this should really bother me, walking away from this kind of heritage. Friends, it didn't. In fact, it was the only road to peace. I'm here to tell you it didn't bother me because something else had taken control of my heart, and that is the convicting truths of the Advent message. Nothing mattered, nothing except doing the will of my Heavenly Father. You see, our mantle, friends, is from heaven. The Advent message has fallen from heaven. And there are millions of people around the world who have had this same experience. Each of you need that experience, dear ones. Well, walking away from tradition of that depth is neither easy or casually done. It wasn't for me. But it was the only road to peace. I surrendered to God in late 1988, and the peace He brought still warms my heart. Without the support of my wife, I was baptized into the Seventh-day Adventist Church on January 7th of 1989. Once again, there was no divine phenomenon. As I rose up out of that water, but the scriptures that I loved as a boy were now permanently fixed in my heart as the great guide to Jesus. and now I understood them with a greater depth than I ever had. And that kind of treasure, my friend, is indeed a heavenly phenomenon. Incidentally, Nancy joined the church 8 months later. I was taught by the Lord not to pressure her during this period of time and to allow her time to come to a conviction. Had she just jumped in the water to be with me, it would not have been hers. It would have been me putting that mantle around her shoulders, but she had to come to the point and the place where she picked it up on her own. And that's what happened 8 months later, and now we were together. For 8 months period of time, although we had to balance something we never balanced before, and that was dissimilar worship practice. God had to show us during that period of time how to connect with each other and how to still be a family and how to guide our children. And we learned a lot of things in that period of time that benefit us now. As we close, 2 questions. What can we learn from the Anabaptist? And what can they learn from us? Can we learn anything from the Anabaptist? I think so. We can learn one of the attributes of simplicity that they model so well. My grandfather, by the way, was Amish, old order Amish. My great-grandparents were Amish. So I'm 25% Amish and 75% German Baptist. It makes a pretty good blend, I think. But I'm 100% Adventist now, both in my head and my heart. Simplicity is something we can learn from the Anabaptist. Family togetherness. Many of us in our fast-paced Western culture need to relearn the beauty of slowing down once in a while and whispering love to our family instead of shouting it. That's one of the things that we can be reminded of. We can also benefit from not being too enamored with academics. In the Amish church, you have 8 grades of education, and that's plenty for them. Most of them are some of the best tradesmen in the entire world. Not to be too enamored with academics. Education is fine. If it's the right kind, I'm all for it. But education can close more doors than it opens sometimes. So be aware of that tension out there. I have 11 grades of education. I only needed a credit and I think 3/4 to finish. And I didn't care about that at all. I wanted to get out of school. School was holding me back. I wanted to start my own business, and that's exactly what I did. No regrets. I've owned a business corporation for 34 years. So don't be too enamored with academics. I notice a trend in the Adventist church where a lot of emphasis is placed upon degrees. In fact, to some degree, the ordination controversy that circles around us at times is predicated upon the presumption that you have to have a degree to do some kind of ministry. That's not true, friends. Anyone can minister to someone else. You can hand someone a cup of warm water or cool water. You can say hi to someone coming out of Walmart and ask them how their day's going. You don't have to have a degree to minister to people. What can the Anabaptists learn from us? A lot. They can learn a number of truths that were lost sight of theologically down through time. It's very interesting to me that some of the early Anabaptists did stumble upon the Sabbath truth, and they began to observe it. But there weren't very many of them. It was not a popular truth at that time, and now it's fascinating to me how some of them are coming back around and accepting the Sabbath. Daniel Lichty, a theologian in the Mennonite church, has been keeping the Sabbath for a number of years. A close friend of mine, family, Andy and Naomi Weaver from Northern Ohio, they came out of the Amish church like my grandfather was. And they've accepted the Advent message, and many, many other people are now discovering the beautiful Adventist truths among the Anabaptist people. This is fascinating. What can they learn from us? The Berean life, in other words, to go into the Bible to see if these things are so. You're not taught that in the Anabaptist church generally. Heavy emphasis is placed upon tradition, and in some ways that may be okay. Paul writes about good tradition. So I'm not against tradition, but it has to be the right kind, doesn't it? What I am against is honoring tradition for tradition's sake when it doesn't have Bible support. So that's our story. That's my story anyway. Thank you for listening. And I'd like to just sum it up by asking this final question. Your mantle, where does it come from? What are you wearing on your shoulders? Has your mantle been placed around your shoulders by tradition or by your parents? Is that all the Advent message means to you? Or have you picked it up and made it your own? The choice is ours, dear friends. God bless you. I hope to see you again someday on the Sea of Glass. Amen.